We should change the order. Suad, are you
Sure.
Suad also has probably seen many changes. She hails from Kenya, is that correct?
Right.
And she is a grad student, not from this, but from CSUMB. Her focus is public policy. And her speech today is speech number 3. She is giving a speech entitled Foreign Aid and Why It Is Not Working in Africa. Suad?
My views on foreign aid and why it's not working in Africa. I know this because I was born in Africa, I went to primary school in Africa, I went to secondary school in Africa, and I went to college in Africa. Therefore, I understand the state of the nation. If you don't know me by now, let me share something with you. I'm controversial, peculiar, but most importantly, pragmatic. Therefore, today, I might say some things that might unsettle you. Madam Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, honored guests. The reason Africa is poor and dysfunctional is because of the foreign aid. I can say this because I'm not a political scientist. I'm an economist by training. I crunch numbers, and if the numbers don't add up, I have a problem. In the last 60 years, let me go back. Let me explain to you what I mean by foreign aid. There are 3 types of aid. There's the humanitarian aid, emergency aid, think of a Katrina or a tsunami. That's not what I'm going to be talking about today. The second type of aid is an NGO, charity-based aid, where you send $10 to educate a girl in Africa. That's not what I'm going to be talking about today. The third type of aid is systematic aid, government-to-government transfer, where rich nations send funds to the African nations. Therefore, let me be clear, I'm not talking about the humanitarian aid, I'm not talking about the NGO, I'm talking about systematic aid, government-to-government transfer. In the last 60 years, over $1 trillion have been sent to the African nation. And yet, Africa is behind on the global stage. Clearly, something is wrong. Your previous president, George W. Bush, had a brilliant saying, and I'm quoting him. By the way, I never thought I would quote him. He said, we should be careful of the soft bigotry of low expectation. I'm afraid to tell you, rich nations have low expectation when it comes to Africa. They don't believe Africans can achieve economic success. Therefore, it's easier for them to write a check and send it to the African nation instead of opening their markets so Africans can trade with them. And, you know, I'm pretty controversial, and someone can argue, oh, what's wrong with giving free money? Let me tell you what it does. It makes leaders and policymakers in Africa lazy because they don't have to work. Their rent is paid. When you go to vote, you know when you vote for that president, he's going to pay for he's going to provide you with public goods, such as infrastructure, education, and healthcare. Africans, when they vote, they're not voting for that president because who's paying for the public goods? Foreigners, international leaders. Therefore, they don't work. They're lazy. And what that does to the Africans, to the African people on the ground, they're the ones who are suffering. The leaders and the policymakers are busy quoting and catering the international community instead of working for the Africans. And I know firsthand how it feels when you're trying to be prudent and your government is not supporting you. Instead, they're working for the foreigners. Here's where it gets personal for me. When it comes to other developing nations, such as China, India, and Brazil, the rich nations have one aid model, which is they use logic, reason, and evidence. It's short, sharp, finite. When it comes to Africa, they have open-ended commitment, and they use emotion. Oh, poor Africans. Ladies and gentlemen, there's more poor people in China than Africa. There's more poor people in India than Africa. But you don't hear this. It's intellectually dishonest to put a whole nation in a box and call them poor. Therefore, I think it's one of those things that when you barely see a Chinese kid on TV begging, you barely see an Indian kid on TV begging. Why only Africans? Let me tell you why. The Chinese and the Indians have already figured this thing out. They don't depend on aid because they know if I'm an investor and I'm watching television and I see an African kid begging on TV and Angelina Jolie and Madonna goes to Africa and adopt the babies and the media gets ballistic, I am not going to that continent to invest. So the Chinese and the Indians have already figured this thing out. They don't depend on the foreign aid. Therefore, I think when you think about foreign aid, especially the systematic aid, government to government, I think it's been 60 years, nothing is working. I have a solution. Here's my solution. If I had 5 minutes with leaders, international leaders, this is what I would tell them. Give us 5 years, turn off the aid tap, open your market, let's trade. So if in 5 years we don't get our act together, we can go back to the model. But give us 5 years. Here's the good news, now that I've depressed you, let me give you some good news. 60% of Africans are under the age of 24. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a young, vibrant generation that doesn't need handouts. They need jobs. That's the generation that's going to transform Africa. That is the generation that's going to define Africa. That is the generation that I'm fighting for. I have tremendous faith in them. That is the reason I'm here in America, studying and figuring out how Africa cannot depend on aid. So I think when you think about Africa, for the last 60 years, they've used their argument on 3 things: corruption, poverty, and diseases. My father is 60 years old. He has lived in Africa. He was born in Africa, never left Africa. I'm afraid to tell you, he's not corrupt, he's not poor, and most importantly, he has no diseases. So they need to figure out, they need to come up with a new way to talk about Africa, because I think the world is changing. 30 years ago, China was poor. Today, America is borrowing from China. I think the leaders should really think about what they need to do. I would leave you with this. Africa is to development what Mars is to NASA. We've spent billions and billions of dollars every day collecting data, analyzing, but we know very well we will never live in Mars. Therefore, the fundamental problem is rich nations don't believe Africa can be developed. Thank you very much.